I'm James Rosone.
And I'm Miranda Watson. We're the husband and wife writing team that created the military thriller Monroe Doctrine series and the military sci-fi series The Rise of the Republic.
We have some additional content we'd like to share with you guys today, and we hope you'll find it informative and entertaining. We're planning to create more videos similar to this in the future.
As always, please like, share, and subscribe. Now let's get started.
Chapter 10. Allegheny Bloodbath. February 13th, 2021. Northwestern Pennsylvania, Allegheny National Forest. "Contact front!" the point man shouted. Then the entire world in front of them erupted in gunfire. "Get down!" Crack, crack, zip, zip. Bullets flew back and forth between the two groups, and a chorus of orders and angry shouts echoed throughout the woods. Sergeant Silverman took a knee next to the side of a tree. He calmly leveled his M249 squad automatic weapon at a cluster of enemy soldiers, maybe 200 meters to his front, and fired several controlled bursts. Silverman saw several of the enemy soldiers go down. Then he lifted up his saw as he pivoted to the opposite side of the tree. A string of bullets hit where he had just been. Realizing the enemy knew where he was, Sergeant Silverman dropped to the ground and rolled awkwardly to the left a couple of times to put some distance between himself and his last firing position. Then he popped up with his weapon at the ready and cut loose on 4 enemy soldiers he saw bounding forward toward his platoon. Bang, bang, bang! He stitched the 4 of them up as they tumbled from their forward momentum. Silverman then dropped to the ground and low-crawled forward to a fallen log he'd spotted. He needed to change firing positions again. Crump. Boom! All around him, grenades went off, and mortar rounds hit. His fellow soldiers fired their M203 grenade launchers. It was pure chaos as his platoon attacked this position for the second time in 2 days. Earlier in the morning, they had hammered the place with a battalion of 155mm howitzers. Now it was time for them to make another attempt at dislodging this Canadian unit that was hell-bent on maintaining control of Allegheny National Forest. "Frag out!" called out one of his platoon mates. Seconds later, Silverman heard the explosion and chose to pop up at that moment to find another target. Silverman saw 2 Canadian soldiers reloading one of their FN mags. Moving his barrel to face them, Sergeant Silverman let loose a 4-second controlled burst and saw both of them get hit with multiple rounds and go down. He also heard and felt the bolt lock to the rear, letting him know he was out of ammo. Silverman ducked back down behind the fallen tree. He removed the empty box magazine and unfastened another one from his vest. He swiftly seated the new one in place, making sure he stayed ready to keep providing fire support to his platoon. "Shift fire to the right and advance!" yelled someone down the line. "Covering fire! Damn, I'm hit! Medic! I need a medic! Grenade! Reloading! Cover me!" Sergeant Silverman popped back up from behind his log and saw 4 of his guys bounding forward toward the enemy position. Several meters in front of them, enemy soldiers were shifting their fire toward them. Silverman pulled the trigger, hitting 2 hostiles and causing the 3rd guy to duck. Then something out of the periphery of his vision caught his attention, and he turned to see what it was, swinging his saw around with him. "Crap, I nearly lit you up, Leary," Silverman exclaimed. Then he ducked back down behind the fallen tree. "Sorry, man. You moved too damn quick for me to keep up, Sergeant," replied Private First Class Leary, his assistant gunner. He was carrying the extra barrel and 2 extra box magazines of ammo for him. "Cover me, Leary," Silverman ordered. "I'm going to move up to that next cluster of trees." Then he jumped up and bounded over the fallen log he'd been using for cover. Leary popped up and fired off a handful of rounds at the enemy position with his M4 before he ducked back down. "It's your turn. I'll cover you," yelled Silverman. He let loose several controlled bursts from the saw, and Leary raced forward to try and keep up. Crump. "Damn, that was close," Leary remarked. "I think I caught a piece from that grenade." He wiped some blood from his cheek. "Stop shooting! Stop shooting, you bloody Yanks! We surrender!" a loud voice called from not so far away. "You hear that? I think they're trying to surrender," Leary echoed. It took a couple of attempts, but eventually a lot of the shooting died down, and it suddenly became quiet. Poking his head around the tree, Silverman saw several soldiers trying to wave something white as they kept calling out that they were trying to give up. Taking up a better firing position at the now exposed enemy soldiers, Silverman yelled to them in his southern accent, "Y'all stand up, throw your weapons down, and walk toward us nice and slow-like." Then he turned to Leary. "Cover my rear. I'm going to move forward." Leary nodded. Sergeant Silverman stood up with his saw at the ready and slowly advanced. Several other soldiers in his platoon did the same. Silverman counted 11 enemy soldiers standing with their hands held high, slowly walking toward them. "Okay, that's enough," shouted their platoon leader. "You guys stay right there while we check you for weapons. Are there any more of you?" He moved forward with a couple more soldiers in tow. "We have some wounded, but I think we're all that's left," called out one of the Canadians. "If you bastards are trying to play possum on us, we're going to kill you all right where you stand," shouted the platoon sergeant. Now that the shooting had largely died down, everyone could hear the groans of the wounded. Others cried out for a medic. Walking toward the Canadians, Silverman shouted, "Y'all move over to that cluster of trees so we can search you together." He motioned where he wanted them to go with the barrel of his saw. "If any of you try to toss a grenade at us or do any other funny business, I'll light you up." A handful of Silverman's platoon mates had taken up covering positions around the Canadians, while a couple of their guys patted them down for weapons. They took their knives, sidearms, and any other weapons from them and dropped them on the ground. Once they had been thoroughly searched and disarmed, several of them led the Canadians back to their rear area, where they could hand them off to another unit for processing. Meanwhile, the rest of the company had advanced forward to help them. The additional medics also moved in to help treat the U.S. and Canadian wounded. Occasionally, a medic would call out for some help to move one of the more egregiously injured soldiers back to the rear. The area was still way too active with enemy soldiers to try and call in a medevac helicopter. "Okay, listen up, guys," their captain called out. "We're going to wait on an ammo resupply, and then we're going to continue clearing this sector out. It's time we send these Canucks packing back to Canada." He sent a dozen guys back to their rear to go collect more ammo and water. They'd refill their canteens from the nearby creeks and rely on their water purifiers to make sure it was clean. Water was heavy, and if they had to choose which to carry more of, water or ammo, they were always going to side with ammo. Sitting down on the ground, Sergeant Silverman opened his patrol pack and grabbed one of the 50-round belts of ammo. He then took his empty box magazine and placed the belt into it and fed it back through the top lip, so it'd be ready when he needed it. Then he undogged the magazine he currently had in the saw and tossed it to his assistant gunner. "Pull one of your belts out from your patrol pack and refill this one, Leary," Silverman directed. "I don't want to have a half-empty magazine when we start again." PFC Leary nodded and went to work. While he was doing that, Silverman grabbed his last unopened pack of strawberry Pop-Tarts. He tore it open and voraciously took a bite, savoring the sugar and carbs. "God, these taste so much better than an MRE," he thought. Silverman suddenly realized Leary was looking at him longingly. He tossed him the remaining Pop-Tart. An hour went by before their ammo runners returned. Everyone grabbed a couple of extra grenades to replace the ones they used, along with additional ammo. They were just about to head out when their captain got a call from battalion. After the call, he walked past Silverman to inform the platoon leader of the situation. Apparently, this particular pocket of Canadian soldiers was a rearguard action, meant to slow us down while the rest of their unit pulled back to Warren, Silverman overheard him say. "Charlie Company is maneuvering to get ahead of that retreating Canadian unit. We've been ordered to link up with Delta Company and to try to get in touch with them. We need to move fast when we get going." Don't slow down or stop for anything until we make contact with them. Understood?" "Copy that, sir," the platoon sergeant answered. "You want my platoon in the lead again?" "No, I'm going to rotate 3rd platoon up," said the captain. "I want you guys to pull rear security for the time being. You guys earned it after this engagement. Good job, Lieutenant." Silverman smiled at the compliment. He loved how the officers got all the attaboys while it was the NCOs who did the actual work, or in this case, fighting. Whatever, I survived, he told himself. Plus none of his friends had gotten killed this time, so he had to count that as a win. The rest of the company moved out ahead of them while they got a few extra minutes to rest their dogs. Many of the guys took the opportunity to charge out their sweat-soaked socks with a pair of dry ones. Most guys in the infantry learned pretty quickly that if they didn't take care of their feet, they wouldn't take care of them. Aside from packing as much ammo as they could carry, every infantryman made sure to carry more than a few pairs of socks, packed away in Ziploc bags to keep them dry. The next 24 hours saw some of the fiercest fighting of the war between the 504th Infantry Regiment of the 82nd Airborne and the Canadian 48th Highlanders. By the end of the second day of fighting, the entire Canadian unit had either been killed or captured. The rest of the Allegheny National Forest was finally retaken by American forces after more than a month of back-and-forth fighting. The heavily wooded area made for a defender's paradise, but with it now securely back in American hands, they could focus on pushing the rest of the UN forces in this sector back toward the border. The remaining blue helmets fell back to a new defensive line south of Buffalo in the city of Hamburg. Arlington, Pennsylvania, Pentagon. Admiral Chester Smith was going crazy with the constant hammering and banging just down the hall. While his office had not been hit during the cruise missile attack on the first day of the war, a section of the Pentagon just down the hall from him had been damaged. Construction crews were working around the clock, getting the exterior of the building patched up and at least closed off from the environment, while other crews began the laborious task of fixing all the plumbing and electrical wiring. The clatter was a constant reminder to Admiral Smith of the loss of friends and the failure of the military to protect the country. When Flight 77 had crashed into the western facade of the Pentagon on September 11, 2001, it had caused a lot of damage to the first 2 rings of the building there. This new attack had caused even more devastation. When the French cruise missiles had hit, they punched through the first ring before detonating in the second. The resulting enormous explosions had damaged both the inner and outer rings of the building near the points of entry. A lot of good people had been killed. Smith tried not to let the noise bother him, but the constant pounding was starting to drive him nuts. One of his aides walked in and handed him a SIG-ACTS. "Sir, I have that report on the latest attack on the blockade you asked for." Admiral Smith nodded and immediately began to read. He felt his expression sour. "So we lost the Saint-Jacques and the Neats?" he asked, disappointed and angry. "I'm afraid so," the aide responded. "The Gonzales and the Stout each took a hit but managed to stay afloat. They are both headed back to port for repairs." "Tell me we at least shot down the backfires that hit us." The aide smiled. "We did. 14 of the 16 that attacked our ships were splashed." Smith sighed loudly. He felt helpless at that moment. In the span of 4 weeks, he'd lost more than 20,000 sailors, nearly a third of the total number of sailors who'd died in all of World War II. 2 carriers had sunk, one with all hands. 4 other carriers had sustained considerable damage and would be in the shipyards for several months before they could be made ready. Then he had 2 other carriers still in the process of being brought out of their programmed refueling and retrofitting. That left him with 3 operational carriers, 2 on the Atlantic side and 1 in the Pacific. In addition to the carrier losses, they'd lost 26 Arleigh Burke destroyers and 8 Ticonderoga-guided missile cruisers. The subsurface losses were just as bad. 16 Los Angeles fast attack subs and 7 Virginia-class subs had been sunk. There wasn't a facet of the Navy that hadn't felt the loss of the past 5 weeks. Couple all of that with an EMP detonation over Hawaii, and the U.S. Navy was in a world of hurt. The 2 carriers Admiral Smith had in the shipyard at Pearl were now more or less dead in the water until they could get parts flown in from the mainland to replace many of the electronics being used to operate the equipment that they needed to repair the flat tops. It was an utter mess. There was a debate underway as to whether or not the carriers could be towed back to Bremerton for repairs, since Washington State had mostly been recaptured. The more immediate challenge Admiral Smith faced was figuring out how he could maintain a blockade of North America and continue to protect the U.S. coastal areas. Considering that Hawaii was no longer an effective forward operating base, it would be tough to prevent the Chinese from being able to ferry more troops and equipment to Mexico and the rest of Central America. While the Navy had reactivated its entire Ghost Fleet, it was going to take time to get many of these ships operational. To further add to his headaches, the Navy had to expedite its training programs in order to have these new ships crewed and ready for combat. To make things even more complicated, they'd lost access to Naval Station Great Lakes at the outset of the war, which meant they had to find and set up a new training facility. For the time being, they were turning Naval Station Mayport in Jacksonville, Florida, into their new training facility. Every time Smith thought they were going to make it, that the worst had passed them, he'd get handed a report like this one. More and more, he just wanted to quit. But he knew he couldn't do that either. His country still needed him, and Admiral Smith knew he couldn't look on his wife if he quit. Not after their eldest son had died on the Truman. No, he was in this fight to the finish. Just as his mind was about to slip off into a dark place, he heard a knock at the door. Looking up, he saw Admiral Thomas Ingalls. Smith stood up and waved his friend in. "It's good to see you, Tom. How the hell are you?" Admiral Ingalls smiled and shook his friend's hand. "I'm good, Chester. How are you holding up? I heard we lost a few more ships today." Admiral Smith grimaced. "We did. I won't lie and say it hasn't been tough, Tom. But what can you do? We have to keep fighting." "I hear you. How's the wife holding up?" Admiral Smith sighed. He closed the door and guided his friend over to the set of couches. "She's doing the best she can. It was tough losing Jerry, but the rest of the family is helping her get through it." Admiral Ingalls nodded and took a seat. "Well, I don't want to dwell on the loss of your son, Chester, so I'll get right down to it. I wanted to provide you with an in-person update on that report you'd asked about." Smith leaned forward, perking up at the mention of their secretive pet project. "Please tell me the ships are still on schedule," he implored. Ingalls shook his head. "We're falling behind. That's why I wanted to talk in person. I'm having a hard time sourcing some equipment and getting the skilled labor I need to get them finished." "What's the problem?" "Armor plating, reactor fuel, and skilled technicians to work on the ship for starters." Admiral Smith rubbed the back of his head anxiously. "How are we short on those items? I thought I had given your program priority. What's going on?" Ingalls let out a forceful sigh. "Nearly half of my workforce has been pulled off the project to work on the ships coming back to port for repairs, so we can get them turned back around and out to sea again. Plus, the reactor fuel that was slated for my program was reallocated to get our 2 other carriers refueled and operational. The shipyards have most of my workers crawling over those 2 ships, and then you add the mess of everything out at Pearl, and you can see why I'm strapped for skilled workers. And then there's the challenge of armor plating." Admiral Smith held a hand up to stop his friend for a moment. What's the matter with the armor plating? I could have sworn we had a problem corrected several months before the war even started. This shouldn't even be an issue." Ingalls shrugged. "Well, let's just say the mills are having a hard time sourcing the raw materials right now, since most of our suppliers are currently at war with us." Smith blew air through his lips, as if he were creating a smoke ring. Then he leaned back on the couch, thinking about the problem. "What if you move all the personnel and supplies to just get the first ship operational? Could that solve part of your problem?" Ingalls shook his head. "No, not entirely. Some of the work needs to be done by skilled labor. Each ship has nearly 600 electricians running wiring and cabling throughout the superstructure and hull. Then we have another 400 pipe fitters and plumbers that follow in behind them. Until those functions are complete, we can't close many of the floors or the walls up. Also, I'm missing most of the nuclear technicians needed to get the reactors put in place and the fuel to get them started. Until those pieces fall into place, I can't even test the ship's power generation or electrical systems. And we haven't even gotten to the point of testing her weapon systems yet. That's going to be an entirely different problem set we'll have to deal with." Smith realized that Ingalls looked exhausted and frustrated, just like him. There were too many tasks to handle, and not enough hours in the day or people to manage them. "What if we pulled the work crews from the shipyards in the Gulf and Pearl and sent them up here to you?" Ingalls' left eyebrow rose skeptically. "You thinking of towing the ships in Pearl back to the mainland?" Smith sighed. "I think we're going to have to. The island's a mess. The entire power grid on the bases, with the exception of our microgrid, is out. Heck, we can't even operate most of the cranes or heavy equipment needed to keep the repairs going. If I can't use the shipyard, then there is no reason to leave the ships in port if they can't get repaired. However, right now, I'm not sure we could properly protect the ships if we towed them to Washington. If a Chinese or Russian sub found them, we'd have no way to maneuver them if they were fired upon." Ingalls laughed uncomfortably. "Man, I thought I had problems to deal with. But back to your offer, yes, it would help. What could speed things up more is if you could either waive or expedite the security clearance required for many of the electricians and plumbers I need. We can advertise the job positions and high-paying salaries all we want, but right now we have a serious bottleneck when it comes to getting these new hires cleared so they can work on the project." "I'll see what I can do about that," Smith countered. "In the meantime, you have to find a way to get those ships done. I know we hadn't planned on fielding them for several more years, but the situation has obviously changed, and we need those ships, especially in the Pacific." "Are you sailing them around Argentina, or are we planning to get Panama back?" Smith smiled. "Let's just say we have a few plans in the works. You just make sure those ships are ready by the end of the year." Chapter 11. Round 1, China. February 13th, 2021, Santa Teresa, New Mexico. A day earlier, 1st Battalion, 37th Armor, had crossed some 30 miles deep into Mexico looking for the Chinese. They had been told the enemy army group had been hit by a tactical nuke, and this would be a cleanup operation. What they'd found instead was 2 brigades worth of tanks and mechanized infantry waiting for them. The subsequent 24 hours had been fought as a delaying action as they waited for the rest of their brigade to get formed up and ready to defend the border. They had been doing what tankers do best in wide-open spaces: fire and maneuver, something the American tankers excelled at. "Tank, 10 o'clock, 3,200 meters," Sergeant Gomez called out as he found the next T-96 charging toward them. "I see it. Fire!" yelled Staff Sergeant Melton, sweat dripping down his face. "Firing!" Boom! The cannon recoiled inside the turret, and the tank rocked back on its springs. "Load Sabo!" shouted Gomez. He watched the round they'd fired reach out for its intended target. The projectile slammed right into the base of the turret, missing the tank's reactive armor. The sabot punched a hole right through the weak spot where the turret and the chassis connect. The force of the projectile and the internal explosion blew the turret right off the tank, cartwheeling 100 or more feet into the sky. Good hit, Gomez. Driver, back us the hell out of here and find us another firing position. While their driver was backing them out, Staff Sergeant Melton was hard at work trying to find them another target. In the span of 2 hours, they'd taken out 12 T-96s as they continued to fall back into New Mexico and Texas. Ranger Actual to all Ranger elements. This is our line in the sand. We hold them here. Thunderbolt element is moving to join us in 20 mics. Let's try and save a few tanks for them. Out. You hear that, Staff Sergeant? Line in the sand. This is it for us, isn't it? Pataki asked sarcastically. Private First Class Andy Pataki was their loader, the most junior guy on the tank and a real pain in the butt. The guy was a total Debbie Downer. If you asked him if the glass was half full or half empty, he always said half empty. Just shut up and keep loading, quipped Sergeant Gomez. Melton will see us through this, okay? I'm going to park us behind that F-150, Staff Sergeant, their driver announced as he pulled the tank up a few feet behind the truck. They still had plenty of room to let the gun traverse without hitting the cab of the truck or anything nearby. That's fine, Melton responded. Just make sure you don't get us too close to it, and be ready to move if I tell you. He scanned for targets from their new vantage point. They heard some rounds blow up not too far away. Hey, is that artillery outgoing or incoming? Asked Pataki nervously. That's incoming. If it was outgoing, you wouldn't hear it blowing up, Gomez replied. He kept his eyes fixed on the scope, scanning for targets with Melton. Ranger 3, get your trophy system ready, called one of the nearby tanks. We have inbound Z-19s. What the hell is a Z-19? Asked Pataki, his voice raising an octave higher. Oh, Lord, don't tell him, Melton, replied their driver. Then he set about making sure their IR-inhibiting smoke grenades were ready. Pulling the zoom out on his commander's sight extension, Melton scanned the horizon for the aerial threats. Found it. He's off to our 3 o'clock. Hit the Dazzler and make sure he can't get a lock on us. Melton activated their anti-tank missile defensive suite and hoped for the best. Hey, those don't look like T-96s, Gomez said as he resumed his hunt for targets. Before Melton could respond, they heard the scream of a jet engine as it flew low and fast over their position. Those are ours, explained Melton before any of his guys could ask. He watched as the F-15 fired off a pair of missiles at the helicopters that were gearing up to attack them. Melton laughed out loud before he hit the intercom button. He just smoked those helicopters. Now what tanks are you talking about? Where should I be looking? Melton asked. They're still pretty far out. I think it's the next attack wave, to our 11 o'clock, 5,000 meters. Turning his commander's sight in the direction his gunner had said, Melton zoomed in as far as their equipment would let him. Damn, that kid's got eagle eyes. I would have missed those tanks until they got closer, he reflected. Melton pulled a Chinese vehicle identifier card out of his breast pocket and looked at it, comparing the tiny image to what he saw on his screen. It's hard to tell from this distance, but I think that might be a Type 99, he announced. If it is, then those are their top-tier tanks. This is probably going to be a big push by them. All Ranger elements, we're going to let Thunderbolt element work over the enemy tanks, their battalion commander announced over the radio. They've taken up positions to our west. We've been ordered to go after the infantry fighting vehicles and APCs. We have additional fast movers inbound, so if you hear fighters, they're ours. You know, I like that about our battalion commander. He goes out of his way to make sure even us lowly sergeants know what's going on, Gomez commented. Here they come. Stand by to engage, Melton directed. 2 new pairs of attack helicopters appeared from further behind the Chinese attacking force and fired off multiple ATGMs at their sister battalion. Melton silently cursed at the new threat, angry that he was powerless to do anything about it. Then, to his surprise, he saw the sky above the attack force light up with strings of anti-aircraft fire. Next, Several missiles took off towards some unseen aerial targets. A few seconds later, 2 of the 4 attack helicopters exploded, and the other 2 dove for cover to try and evade whatever had been fired at them. Brr. Whew. Did you see that A-10? He just took 3 tanks out in a single pass, Gomez called out excitedly to Melton. As he watched the scene unfold before him, Melton saw the A-10 bank hard to the left as the pilot sought to regain some altitude after his attack run. The aircraft spat out flares the whole time, while multiple strings of anti-aircraft fire raced after it. 2 missiles flew up from the ground and chased the A-10. Both projectiles hit one of the flares. Then one of the strings of enemy tracers managed to cut right across the left side of the aircraft. It blew out one of the engines and ripped part of the wing right off. The damaged aircraft now trailed smoke and flames as the pilot struggled to try and escape the incoming fire. ZBD identified. 3,500 meters, 3 o'clock. Load Sabo, Gomez called out. Melton shook the image of the A-10 from his mind and returned to the job of fighting the tank before him. He mirrored his sight to what his gunner had found for him. Sure enough, there was a wave of ZBDs, ZBLs, and ZSDs charging right behind the tanks. They were the primary infantry fighting vehicles of the PLA's mechanized force and packed an arsenal of anti-tank guided missiles. "I got 'em," Melton announced. "Loader, switch to heat rounds going forward. I want to save our Sabo rounds for actual tanks. Fire as soon as he crosses the 3,200-meter mark. Driver, we're going to fire 5 rounds from this position and then move, so start thinking about where you want to move us." Once the shooting started, everything was going to happen very rapidly, so Melton wanted to make sure the game plan was set. A minute went by, and then Gomez started the action. "Firing!" he yelled. Boom! The glass windows on the Ford F-150 in front of them exploded from the concussion of their cannon firing. They all watched as his round raced across the more than 3,000-meter divide. Gomez cursed when he saw the round just miss the vehicle. "Load heat!" he barked. "It's okay, Gomez. We all miss sometimes. You'll get him with this next round," Melton said as he sought to reassure his gunner. Pataki hit the button on the ammo locker, opening it up. He reached down and grabbed the heat round from the second to bottom row. Within 6 seconds of having fired the first round, Pataki had the heat round loaded and ready to fire. "Heat up! Firing! Boom! Load heat!" "ZBS identified," called out Gomez. The Chinese vehicles were doing their best to change their course, sometimes doing short zigzags, or slowing down and then speeding up in an attempt to throw off the tank gunners shooting at them at the last minute. "Good hit, Gomez. You nailed him," Melton announced. "Heat up! Firing! Boom! Load heat!" Before Gomez could fire another round, their driver threw the vehicle in reverse and gunned it. A fraction of a second later, the F-150 truck in front of them exploded. The front half of the tank got showered with shrapnel and debris. Then the tank lurched forward as they advanced to the next firing position. While they were moving, a series of artillery rounds plastered everything around them. From inside, it sounded like a hailstorm as shrapnel peppered one side and then the other. The near misses bounced the entire tank around despite its heaviness. Suddenly their vehicle stopped, and the gears made an odd noise. "What's going on?" called out Melton, fearing one of those misses might have hit something important. "I think we threw a track," called out the driver. "Oh, crap. Gomez, start searching for a target. Make sure no one's getting close to us. I'm going topside to see what kind of damage we're looking at." Melton undogged the commander's hatch and pushed it open. Pulling himself up out of the turret, he hopped down onto the chassis and then down to the ground. Looking at the right side of the tank, he saw it was dented in a few spots and had a ton of scratch marks from shrapnel, but the tanks and gears appeared to be in good order. He then moved around to the left side of the tank and immediately saw the problem. A piece of shrapnel had gotten wedged between one of the tank sprockets and the track. Had their driver tried to power his way through the grinding noise, Chances are he would have thrown the track. If that had happened, they would have been stuck until a wrecker could have come to get them. Given they were in the middle of a battle, that would pretty much have been the end of them as a fighting tank. Melton climbed back up into the vehicle and stuck his head in the turret. "Pataki, I need your help," he hollered. "Grab the toolkit and come assist me. Gomez, get up here on the gun in case we need you to cover us." While Melton and Pataki used a crowbar and some other tools to pry the piece of metal out of where it had gotten stuck, the sounds of battle continued to rage. All around them, tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, mortars, artillery, and helicopters from both sides were in a desperate clash. It was terrifying being stuck outside their armored shell, unable to fight or do anything until they got their track system fixed. After a couple of minutes, Melton and Pataki finally got the piece of metal yanked out of where it had gotten wedged, and their driver moved the tank forward a couple of feet with them, observing it to make sure the track and the sprocket were good to keep moving. Once they were back in the tank, their driver sped forward. At this point, the enemy had closed to within 1,500 meters. They were now at the edge of the U.S.-Mexico border. "Staff Sergeant, I'm going to reposition us over near the Sunland Park Elementary School," the driver announced over the intercom. "There's a couple Bradleys and Strikers taking up a position near the neighborhood. They look like they could use a tank, and we need some infantry support." "Good call. Get us moving," Melton replied. "Gomez, turn the gun around, and let's try and see what we can find." Looking through the commander's sight extension, Melton saw most of the enemy armor was moving further west. He also saw additional helicopters on the horizon, which could prove problematic for them. He grabbed the radio. "Ranger 6, this is Ranger 3. We've relocated to the Sunland Park Elementary School. I see some helicopters on the horizon. Do we have any additional air support that can deal with them?" It took a minute for Melton to get a reply. Their CO knew about the helicopters and had placed a call in for help, but he was unsure if or when they'd receive it. An hour went by as their company consolidated on the elementary school and formed up with the 2 Bradleys and 3 Strikers. Including Melton's tank, they had 7 of them left. 28 hours of combat, and they had been whittled down from 16 tanks to just 7. They had lost a lot of friends already, and they were far from safe. Sergeant Higgins felt a lot better now that a few tanks had come over to their position. For a while there, the 1st Battalion 6th Infantry Regiment was down to just their couple of Stryker vehicles and a few Bradleys. Not exactly an ideal setup when facing down a brigade of enemy tanks and mechanized infantry. They needed armor to deal with this threat, and that was something the Americans appeared to be short of. His lieutenant walked up to him in a rush. "Higgins, get your fire team up on the top floor of that building and set your machine gun up in one of the windows. Your team needs to cover this field of fire. See if you can't get a couple of javelins positioned in some of the nearby classrooms as well. If you spot any troops or armor heading our way, radio me and let me know. I'm sending Bravo team to that building over there. They'll cover your flank while you help cover theirs. Got it?" He pointed to the 2 buildings where he was deploying 1st Squad. Looking at the school building, Higgins nodded. "On it, sir." Higgins turned to find his guys, then barked out some orders for them to each grab a javelin and some extra ammo for their lone M240G machine gun. If the LT wanted them to set up a position on the top floor, then he wanted to make sure they had enough ammo and supplies for whatever might be coming their way. After his fire team entered the school, they eventually found their way to a stairwell that led them to the 3rd floor. It took them a few minutes to find the best room for setting up the machine gun. While Higgins initially wanted to set up in the corner room, he realized that it'd be the most likely room the enemy would blow up, so he moved one room over. He then had his guys place a javelin in the next couple of rooms down the hallway. His thinking was that his team could fire one, then move down the hall to shoot the next one. This way, if the enemy fired at them, they'd be long gone and shooting from a different position. "Sergeant, I think we have some vehicles headed our way," called out one of the corporals. A second later, they heard two of the tanks nearby fire their main guns. Clearly, they had found something to shoot. Walking up to his corporal, Higgins pulled his pocket binos out of a pouch on his vest and put them to his eyes. "Damn, that looks like a dozen of them headed our way," he realized. "Good eye, Corporal." Higgins pressed the talk button on his radio. "Lieutenant, we've got movement," he explained. "Looks like about a dozen or so IFVs and APCs headed our way. I spotted a couple of tanks with them, but it looks like our tanks are taking them out. Do you want us to start using the javelins on the IFVs or APCs?" "Take out the IFVs first. They have more firepower, and we only have a handful of them." "Good copy. Out." He turned to Corporal Myers. "Start hitting those IFVs with our javelins, Corporal," he ordered. "When you've shot them all off, come back here and get ready to help these guys." He then moved over to the two privates manning their machine gun. "We've got some APCs and IFVs headed our way. Make sure you guys are watching that neighborhood over there. If I were those Chinese soldiers, I'd do my best to get inside that area and use it for cover to attack us." "Roger that, Sergeant. We'll be ready for them," the soldiers responded. This fight was gearing up to be their first actual conflict of this new war. While they had been accompanying the armor battalion for the last day, they hadn't had the opportunity to engage any enemy infantry. Their striker had fired a couple of TOWs at some tanks, but they were out of missiles. All their platoon had left was 6 javelins spread between the 4 squads. The radio came to life. "Sergeant Higgins, I'm ready to engage those vehicles," announced Corporal Myers from next door. "You want me to start?" "Yeah, let's get this show started." Pop, swoosh, bang! Higgins watched the javelin fly out toward the enemy vehicles. They were shooting it like an AT-4, straight and level, as opposed to a top-down attack. There wasn't room for that kind of shot from inside the school. As the anti-tank guided missile raced through the air toward the enemy vehicles, some of them popped some IR-inhibiting smoke to try and throw the guidance system off. The missile was halfway to its target when Higgins heard the second javelin fire. The beautiful thing about the javelin over the TOW, or the older Dragon ATGMs, was that the javelin was a true fire-and-forget weapon. Once the target was locked in, the onboard targeting computer would guide the missile to the objective without any operator guidance. Boom! Higgins saw the ZBDO-4 Myers had shot at explode. The vehicle came to a halt as flames engulfed it. Higgins scanned to watch the second missile. Unfortunately, he did so just in time to watch it get blown up by some sort of countermeasure, right before it was about to make impact. Dang, it was going to hit one of those Type 89s too, he thought. The Type 89 tracked armored fighting vehicles were considered deadly, and they could carry 13 soldiers, a full squad. "Get down!" yelled one of the privates. He dove at Higgins, knocking him to the floor. An instant later, the entire room was suddenly getting ripped to shreds by a heavy-caliber machine gun. Then it sounded like one of the rooms they'd fired the javelin from blew up. A second later, the room right next to them was hit, showering them with dust, smoke, and pieces of the ceiling. "Get back on the gun!" shouted Higgins. He pushed himself up and went to check on Myers. As he entered the hallway, Sergeant Higgins was shocked by the scene before him. The passageway was strewn with debris, burning papers and school supplies. He kept walking forward anyway. As his eyes focused on an object further down, he realized he was looking at an arm. "What the hell?" he thought. And then it occurred to him that this was all that was left of Corporal Myers. Shaking the image from his mind, he turned to head back to his machine gun crew. Rat-a-tat-tat, rat-a-tat-tat. His machine gun team was already firing at something, which meant the enemy must be close. Higgins got a couple of feet away from the room when an explosion blew him backward. His body slammed against the wall of lockers behind him. He slumped down on the ground, his head spinning. Trying to shake off the effects of the blast, Higgins looked at the room the rest of his squad was in and saw that the door and most of the wall was missing. Something had blown it up. No, no, no. I can't lose more of my guys, he thought. Higgins suddenly felt a surge of adrenaline. He popped up and raced through the hole that used to be a doorway into the room. His heart sank. The two privates were torn apart. They were both dead, their bodies ripped apart by the explosion. Zip, pop, bang! The front of the school building was being lit up by small arms fire now. In addition to the bullets smacking the walls, Higgins heard explosions nearby and felt the reverberations in his chest. His radio came to life. "Higgins, if you're still alive, I need you to get your machine gun back up and running," said his lieutenant. "We have Chinese soldiers trying to push through the neighborhood nearby." The sound of rifles and machine guns in the background of the transmission came through loud and clear. Sergeant Higgins depressed the talk button. "I'm on it, LT." Looking around, Higgins found the M240G and grabbed it. He moved over to the blown-out wall of the building. It was easy to see what the lieutenant was talking about. At least 30 or 40 enemy soldiers were bounding toward them. Scanning the area swiftly, he also saw that 2 of the 3 strikers had been blown up, and so had both of the Bradleys. A couple of the tanks were raging infernos, but a few of them were still firing away at the enemy vehicles. Higgins leveled the machine gun at a group of enemy soldiers, depressed the trigger, and fired several 3- and 5-second bursts at them. Some of the Chinese infantry went down while many more scrambled to find cover. He shifted his fire to another group of enemy soldiers he spotted charging forward. The next 5 minutes went by in a blur, as Sergeant Higgins went through 3 belts of ammo. After several attempts by the Chinese to take the school, they fell back to try and regroup. Higgins and the other fire team had done it. They had held the enemy off from taking their position, at least for the time being. Fountain, Colorado. Chip Peterson sat in his Dodge Ram, parked on the side of the frontage road that ran alongside Interstate 25, just south of Colorado Springs. He grabbed a strip of the beef jerky he'd picked up a few hours earlier and took a bite. Then he watched the cars zip past him as he waited. After a few more bites of jerky, he grabbed the Bing energy drink he'd purchased and guzzled half of it down before he turned on the radio. It was time for his favorite show. Tim, the professor, Long, who hailed from the University of Colorado Boulder, held a 3-hour block on Saturdays during which he usually gave a political and economic analysis of what had been going on in the world during the last week. The program had started out as a local affair, mostly followed by students who were stuck having to listen to it, but it had taken off during the primaries and election cycle in 2020. When President-elect Marshall Tate called for the formation of a civil defense force in every state, the professor had jumped right on board. The man had been a recruiting genius on the college campuses, rallying thousands of people to join the Colorado CDF. When the governor opted to stay on the side of the federal government, instead of siding with the man Chip saw as the true president, the professor's popularity rose even more. He and officials from the CDF often postulated about ways to remove the Colorado governor and replace him with other state legislators that had sided with Marshall Tate's camp. As Chip sat in the truck, listening to the professor go on about how more people needed to rise up against the federal government, Chip's phone chirped, letting him know he had a new text. One of his scouts had spotted the Army convoy leaving the base. A smile crept across his face. It won't be long until they pass through our ambush. Chip polished off the rest of his energy drink, and then he finally spotted what he had been waiting for. A convoy of JLTVs, Humvees, Stryker vehicles, and FMTVs was heading right for him. The 4th Infantry Division's 3rd Armored Brigade combat team had redeployed from the Dakotas. Now they were moving down to reinforce the Army in New Mexico and Texas. Chip knew that if they reached their destination, they would blunt or at least slow down the Chinese liberating force. Chip continued to scan the advancing convoy with his binoculars until he spotted a long line of M-1070 heavy equipment transporters moving toward him. The HETs were massive tractor-trailers and flatbeds that the Army used to transport the 62-ton Abrams battle tanks cross-country when not using the railroads. Chip reached for his smartphone and placed a quick call to Dusty. "Hey, the trucks are on their way. Tell Jimmy to deliver the package." "Roger that," came the reply, and then the line went dead. Chip turned his truck back on and pulled a quick U-turn so he could see down the opposite direction of traffic. He wanted to witness the results of their handiwork. He also pulled out his phone and got it ready to record what was about to happen. "This will make for YouTube gold when I'm done with it," he thought. Lifting his binoculars to his eyes, he saw Jimmy's fuel tanker head down Santa Fe Avenue. At that point, Chip put his binos down and started recording what was about to unfold. Once Jimmy's 18-wheeler and fuel tank drove over the southbound lanes, he pulled the truck over to the shoulder as best he could and stopped. He hit the hazard lights and went to work. Chip watched as Jimmy got out of the rig and walked around to the passenger side of the trailer. Chip couldn't zoom in to see exactly what he was doing next, but he knew from what they had talked about earlier that he'd take a packet of matches out of his breast pocket and affix a lit cigarette to it. He'd then place it on the ground near the front tire. It would take a few moments to burn down to the matches, but once it did, it would give them the needed flash to make things go boom. Chip continued to follow Jimmy as he made his way down to the center of the trailer and unscrewed the caps on the fuel outlet valves. He then opened the tanks up, releasing the 11,000 gallons of diesel and gasoline stored in the 4 different storage tanks. At this point, Chip pulled the image back a little bit so the viewer could see the fuel running over the bridge and spilling onto the southbound lanes below. With this last task completed, Chip watched as Jimmy ran to the old Chevy on the opposite shoulder of the road that was waiting for him. Chip returned the camera to the tanker that was leaking fuel everywhere. Knowing that he was still recording, Chip used his best radio voice to say, "You don't even have to be a soldier or own a weapon to help the CDF. Even this truck driver was able to do his part. We need more people like this. People willing to stand up to tyranny and fight for this country. Fight against this fascist dictator that won't leave office." As he finished his little recruitment speech, Chip watched as the first HETs began to pass underneath the bridge and were thoroughly doused with diesel and gasoline. Meanwhile, traffic on the bridge was starting to back up behind the truck as people realized it was now leaking fuel everywhere. The fuel continued to roll onto the overpass, and a steady stream of it spilled off the bridge to the interstate below, splashing on the vehicles and trucks passing underneath. Many of the drivers below began to apply their brakes, while others did their best to either pull over and see what had doused their vehicle or try to move around and avoid getting hit with the unknown liquid. A police car approaching the area spotted the mess and immediately turned on his lights as he sought to gain control of the situation and figure out what was going on. Chip felt a moment of panic as he saw the police officer get out of the cruiser and head for the truck, looking for the driver. He kept the smartphone recording, though, waiting for the flash that would ignite the entire thing. The third and fourth HETs passed under the overpass, and then it happened. The cigarette had finally burned down to the packet of matches, igniting them. A fraction of a second later, the entire bridge blew up in a massive fireball of flaming liquid. Burning fuel was thrown in all directions from the force of the blast, including into the interstate below. The Army's tanks were covered in liquid flame. Dozens of vehicles and trucks slammed on their brakes, trying to escape the flaming cauldron that had become the overpass. The multi-vehicle pileup that ensued would take hours to unravel. God only knows how long it'd take to put the fires out, Chip thought happily. He kept his smartphone recording for another 5 minutes. He wanted to make sure he had plenty of footage for them to cut and use later. If they were lucky, this single act would inspire many more people to carry out similar attacks on the military. For his part, Chip and his motley crew of 5 CDF members had just delivered what they hoped would be the first of many blows against the fascist in the White House. Chapter 12. The Hunt. February 20th, 2021. Bakerton, West Virginia. Master Sergeant Bruce Deuce Wilder shivered. The night air felt extra cold as it whipped through the open bay of the Black Hawk. Their helicopter raced along, just above the tree line as they sped their human cargo toward the target. Deuce pulled his earbuds out and turned off his fight song as they got closer to the objective. He liked listening to Rob Bailey's song Hungry right before a kill mission. Something about the lyrics got his blood pumping. Looking across the jump seat, Deuce saw his partner and friend, Sergeant First Class Larry Flint, going through his own pre-mission ritual. Each man on the team had their own thing they did prior to a mission like this, one that was explicitly designated as a kill mission. They'd been instructed there were to be no prisoners during this op. It had taken the NSA several weeks to track down the Russian Spetsnaz unit that had devastated their ranks during a brazen attack on the industrial park opposite their headquarters. However, through an extensive electronic collection of traffic cameras, home security cameras, business security cameras, and then some good old-fashioned human intelligence, they'd finally tracked down the Russians to an Airbnb in the small West Virginia town of Bakerton. Given the intelligence, the president had authorized JSOC to terminate the threat with extreme prejudice. Brigadier General Lancaster, who'd led the missions in Kosovo, tasked Delta with the job. 5 mics, shouted the crew chief to the Spartans in the back. Looking out the door, Deuce saw the 2 little birds flying in formation with them. Further back were 2 Apache gunships, which would be responsible for any direct fire support they needed. The pilot banked the helicopter hard to the right, gaining some altitude as they climbed over a ridge. The Black Hawk twisted slightly in the air as it dove back down and headed for the farmhouse. "Here we go," shouted Deuce over their team's internal comms system. The pilot pulled up hard on the helicopter, bleeding off speed at an incredible rate before he leveled out and landed on the front yard of the property. In seconds, Deuce and the 6 operators in the helicopter had dashed off, guns aimed at the farmhouse. 100 meters to their right, the 2 little birds landed, dropping the 4-man team that would clear the barn and the outbuildings on the property. As the helicopters lifted off, the front window of the farmhouse erupted in shards of glass. Flames spat out from the barrel of a rifle that began firing at them. "Contact front!" yelled Deuce. He aimed his weapon at the window, then sent a couple of 3-round bursts that way. "Engaging!" yelled Larry as they continued their charge. While still running forward, he fired his MK-48 into the front room of the farmhouse, shattering the window and splintering the walls with 7.62 millimeter bullets. The covering fire would force the enemy down while they advanced. Deuce rapidly closed the distance to the house and bounded up the front stairs, taking them 2 at a time. He slammed against the wall near the door from his momentum. He and another team member waited to the side as Sergeant First Class Pedro Spider Santos, their breacher, slapped the stick of explosives on the door. As soon as they were on, Spider pulled back to the rest of the team, who were stacked along the side of the wall, ready to assault the house. "Breaching!" Spider yelled as he detonated the small charge, blowing the door inward. Then he tossed in a flashbang, and they all shielded their eyes for just a moment. Bang! As soon as they heard it go off, they dashed inside with guns at the ready. "Clear!" yelled Deuce as he finished sweeping the front room. He'd found 2 bodies, but no active threat. "Movement in the kitchen!" shouted Spider from the opposite side of the house. Deuce swept his scar in the direction of the kitchen and fired a dozen rounds into the wall and door frame, hoping to catch whoever was in there. 2 other members from his team fired their own rifles into the kitchen and eating area as they charged forward to clear the rest of the first floor. Deuce was about to head upstairs with his partner, Larry, when he heard footsteps above them. Pointing his scar to the ceiling, Deuce fired a string of shots into the room above them. Plaster rained down on him. Larry ran to the next room and lit up the ceiling there as well, in case another shooter was up there waiting for them. Deuce made a beeline toward the staircase to try and catch whoever was up there by surprise and take him out. He tossed his now empty magazine into his drop bag and slapped a fresh one in place to get ready. He bounded up the steps, but stopped just short of the top when a string of bullets flew right in front of him. Deuce dropped down to a knee, then popped up to fire his scar at the attacker, hitting him several times in the chest and face. Sensing something coming up behind him, Deuce turned right as a burly man pounced on top of him with a large hunting knife in hand. Deuce caught his arms just in time to prevent him from driving the blade right through the side of his body armor. The 2 of them fought on the ground for a moment, grunting and screaming at each other as they struggled for their lives. The fight lasted less than 10 seconds. Larry had run up the stairs to aid his friend, and when he reached the landing, he kicked the attacker across his face with his steel-toed boot. The man was flung off Deuce from the force of the kick. He appeared stunned by the blow to the head, but his eyes went wide for the briefest of seconds as Larry leveled an MK-48 at the man's chest and fired a dozen rounds into him. After rolling onto his knees, Deuce jumped up with his scar still attached to his rig and proceeded to finish clearing the rest of the rooms on that level. "Top floor cleared. Ground floor cleared. Cellar cleared." With no more Russians alive in the house, Deuce's team headed outside to make sure their other comrades didn't need any help. They heard some shooting coming from the barn, and they rushed to assist their fellow soldiers. Seconds later, they heard the call. "Barn cleared. Outbuildings cleared." The 2 Apaches circled the farm, using their thermal scanners to make sure no one had escaped. They hovered in opposite ends of the property, eventually calling it all clear over the radio. With the location now cleared, the operators started dragging all the dead bodies outside to the front of the farmhouse as a sensitive site exploitation team landed. The SSE team would go through the farmhouse and the surrounding buildings on the property, collecting evidence and biometrics on everything they could. All of this information would be fed back to the NSA for further analysis as they sought to determine if the group of 10 bodies constituted the entire Russian team or if more of them may still be alive out there somewhere. Slowly and steadily, the NSA and FBI were tracking down the enemy special forces teams operating within the country while the unit systematically wiped them out as they were found. Stark, Florida, Camp Blanding. Lieutenant Colonel Seth Mitchell sat at his desk, looking at the mountain of paperwork before him. He sighed. Shifting his gaze out the window, Seth saw that the sun was creating a beautiful dawn display. The orangish-red hues were mixing with the white clouds and the blue hues of the new day. Sunrises in Florida were always beautiful. At least that's how he felt about them. Over the early morning chirping of birds, Seth could hear the morning cadence calls of the NCOs working the new batch of recruits over on the parade field. One group of recruits was being run hard by their platoon sergeant. Another group was being smoked, doing endless front-back goes until they vomited their guts out. A third group was doing a CrossFit routine, while a fourth group was participating in morning yoga. Seth snickered at the yogis. He gave his NCOs a lot of latitude in how they wanted to PT their recruits. His only guidance was to get them fit without breaking their bones or excessively injuring them. In a way, this new assignment General Royal had given him was an ideal Special Forces mission. Instead of training up an indigenous force in a foreign country, they were helping Homeland Security train up a federal law enforcement force to put down an internal rebellion growing within their own country. The training they were putting the recruits through was rough. The first week of training focused a lot on stretching and cardiovascular training. They gradually worked them into more physical exercises. It was challenging because they only had 4 weeks with the recruits before they shipped them off to wherever they were being assigned. The recruits' days were long, beginning at 0430 hours with 90 minutes of physical training. They were only given 60 minutes to get a shower, change, and eat before they started class at 0700 hours. One platoon would be handed off to a group of federal law enforcement training instructors from the FLETC Academy, who'd spend a few hours going over the law enforcement procedures they'd be responsible for as a member of the Federal Protective Service. Then the platoon would rotate back to their Special Forces instructors for weapons training, patrolling, combat maneuvers, or other military tactics and training they may need to perform their new duties. It was slow going, but Seth's training brigade was now fully running. They were churning out 1,000 new FPS officers every week. His training command had initially started with a couple of FBI, DHS, and FLETC trainers and 50 Special Forces soldiers. By the end of their 3rd week of operations, the FBI had sent another 80 instructors, and the DoD had finally seen fit to provide him with an additional 300 soldiers to help run the training, and 100 more to fill in a lot of the support functions. In the span of 7 weeks, they had transformed Camp Blanding into a world-class training facility. Seth realized he'd spaced off looking at the sunrise long enough and refocused himself on the mountain of paperwork before him. The packet he opened first contained the personnel files of 4 of their new recruits that one of their first sergeants had singled out. The individuals had prior knowledge or showed a level of leadership that would make them prime candidates to become sergeants or officers at the end of the training course. Seth's unit was under a lot of pressure to not only get these recruits trained, but also identify potential leaders to lead them. Once approved, the candidates would stay to receive additional training. Sergeants would be given 3 weeks of training, and officers would receive 4. During those courses, they would learn advanced small unit tactics, communications, and some necessary administrative functions they'd need to know as first and second-line managers in what was essentially a very military-centric force. Seth knew the job he was performing was essential to the mission and kept him out of harm's way, but he missed being assigned to a team. The short stint in Kosovo reminded him of how much he liked being in the thick of the action, where it was easy to see that he was making an impact. Now his country had been invaded, and instead of carrying out Special Forces missions against the invaders, he was stuck trying to rapidly train up an internal DHS security force. Knock, knock. Looking up, Seth saw a face he hadn't expected to see. "Smith, what are you doing down here?" he asked, bewildered. "It's good to see you, too," Smith responded with a mischievous grin. "Mind if we go for a walk?" Yeah, sure," Seth stammered. He grabbed his beret as they headed out the door. Neither of them said a word as they walked through the hallway of the old building on their way to the exit. They ambled past the parade ground where the recruits were doing their morning routine and continued to stroll toward the dock along the lake. Finally, Smith turned to look at Seth. "Are you enjoying this training gig your boss set you up with?" he asked. Seth snickered. "Mine is not to ask why, but to do or die," he replied, giving the standard military non-response to such a troublesome question. "That's what I thought," Smith said with a smile. He pointed to the bench on the dock. "Here, let's take a seat. No one can hear us talk out here, and you don't exactly have a skiff at this joint." "You know, we could go for a drive if you'd like," Seth offered. No, I'd rather talk out here and watch the sunrise. It's a beautiful day, isn't it? Nodding, Seth didn't say anything. He just waited for Smith to get to the point of why he was here. Remember when we were in Kosovo and you interrogated that Chinese national? Smith asked. Wen Zhenyu. Yeah, I remember him. What about it? We've had him at one of our black sites, and we've continued our conversation. Let's just say he's provided a bit more information since you last spoke with him. Seth's left eyebrow rose. As a matter of fact, he's helped us piece together a few aspects of what's been going on with this whole UN-led mission and the Chinese invasion. The whole world, and in particular our country, has been played from the beginning. It's been very Sun Tzu, if you ask me. Seth shook his head. He thought from the beginning that there was a larger grand plan involved in orchestrating this charade. He just hadn't been able to put his finger on who was pulling the strings. While he was managing this training program at Camp Blanding, he'd gotten removed from that world, effectively cut off from the classified side of things. So how do I fit into all of this? Seth asked. You're clearly here talking to me for a reason. Now it was Smith's turn to smile. You always were sharp, Seth. I like that about you. Well, you're right. I'm not here for a social call or to inspect your training program, which I will say looks impressive considering how little time you had to throw it together. I'm here because I need you. Seth slumped his shoulders. Well, you're talking to the wrong person, he responded. General Royal specifically assigned me to this program. Seth waved his hand in the air as if swatting off a fly. That's already been taken care of, Seth. You've been effectively reassigned back to the agency. What? Asked Seth incredulously. How'd you manage to pull that off? Once you work for us, Seth, you never really leave. I made the case that we needed you and your specific skill set, and it was signed off on. When we get back to your office, your new orders will be on your desk, and your replacement should be there waiting for us, Smith explained with a mischievous grin. Seth shook his head in disbelief. Who are you really, and what is your position within the agency? He pressed. That's not important, Smith said jovially. What is important is that we uncovered some new information, and I've put together a small team to go hunt down the missing pieces. This is important, Seth. The world has been hoodwinked, and it's up to us to uncover this plot and reveal its true nature to the rest of humanity. Our country's future depends on us getting this right and doing it sooner rather than later. Okay, Smith, Seth replied with a nod. Count me in. Not that I really have a choice, but yes, let's go hunt these guys down and expose this plot. Warrenton, Virginia, Camp Perry. Seth entered the dormitory and summarily plopped his hockey bag down on the bed. He walked over to the closet and opened it up. There were about a dozen wooden hangers in there, along with an ironing board and iron. Looking at his watch, he saw he had about 40 minutes before he was needed in the briefing room. Unzipping his bag, he went to work on getting his clothes and a few personal items he'd brought unpacked. Seth wasn't sure how long he'd be here, but he didn't like living out of a suitcase or duffel bag if he didn't have to. Midway through, he pulled his picture frame out and sighed as he looked at his most recent family photo, a picture of all of them at Disney. It was hard to comprehend that this memory was from 4 short months ago. It felt like a lifetime had happened since then. It angered Seth to know that his country was being torn apart by some outside force. As a husband, father, and soldier, he felt powerless to stop it. When Smith had shown up in Florida the other day, he'd had a twinge of hope that he might just have a shot at going after the people or group that had started this whole thing. 30 minutes later, Seth made his way down the hallway to the briefing room where he'd been told to meet his new team. As he reached the entrance, he stopped and took a deep breath. Then he pulled the door open and walked in. Seth smiled when he saw Brigadier General William Lancaster from JSOC, who was now sporting a second star. Sitting next to him was Lieutenant Colonel Patrick "Paddy" Maine. Seth knew he was a squadron commander at Delta. He'd been with them in Kosovo. Both men returned the smile, obviously glad that Seth was joining them on this new team. Seth walked up to Lancaster with his hand extended. "Congrats, sir, on the second star. I hadn't heard you were promoted." Standing, Lancaster shook his hand. "Thanks, Seth. I owe it in large part to your cracking Wen back in Kosovo. It's good to have you on the team with us. I have a feeling we're going to need your area of expertise again soon." Paddy also stood up and shook Seth's hand. "It's good to have you with us, Mitchell." Just then, a handful of scruffy-looking men wearing 5'11" clothes walked in and took a seat near Paddy. They nodded at Seth, but mostly kept to themselves. More people started filtering into the room, some wearing military uniforms, others wearing civilian attire. A few minutes went by, and eventually the room filled. The crowd was nearly split between those in military and those who weren't. Clearly, whatever was in the works was going to require both skill sets. A woman in a business suit walked in and made her way to the front of the room. She cleared her throat to get their attention. "Good morning, everyone. I'm going to pass out a sign-in roster that I need everyone to sign. Use your legal name and social security number. Next, I'm going to have each of you sign a document reading you on to the special access program you're now a part of. This is non-optional. You either sign or you will be reassigned immediately. When everyone has completed this, I'll collect the papers and signatures and we'll begin." She walked up and down each of the rows, handing everyone the appropriate paperwork. The legalese on the document was mostly benign, except for the line stating, "I understand that if I talk about this program or my participation in this program, I will be tried for treason." Seth almost laughed at that, but when he thought back to what Smith had told him, he realized the secrecy involved and the importance of the program. They were serious. He swallowed and signed, feeling a bit more somber. After a moment, the woman in the business suit came around and collected everyone's signed papers. Then she placed them all in a folder and left the room. Next, FBI Director Nolan Polanski walked in. He was quickly followed by Tony Wilds, the Deputy Director of the NSA, and Marcus Ryerson, the Director of the CIA. Then, to their collective surprise, President Jonathan Sachs came through the door, flanked by a handful of heavily armed men knitted out in combat gear and weapons. Everyone jumped to their feet when the president entered the room. The military men moved to the position of attention until told otherwise. Whatever they were about to be a part of was extremely important if the leaders of the nation had come here to talk with them personally. Not missing a beat, the president walked to the front of the room. He surveyed the men and women gathered there before he announced, "I won't take up a lot of your time. Director Polanski and Ryerson will brief you on the details of why you're here and what you'll be doing. I'm here because I first want to thank you for volunteering for this mission. Second, I want to instill upon you the importance of what you're about to embark upon. Our nation has been attacked and invaded. A small group of people has put into motion a series of events designed to destroy our nation and supplant America as a world power. We can't allow that to happen. Each of you has been chosen because you have a specific skill set needed to accomplish this mission. I want each of you to know that you have my backing to do whatever is necessary to accomplish this mission. You will be given every available resource you need, and every effort will be made to assist you in completing the tasks ahead of you. I don't want to say you guys have a blank check to do whatever you want, but the leash has been taken off, so to speak. With that, I'm going to leave and let these gentlemen get you guys up to speed on what's transpired these past few weeks." The president then turned and left the room with his bodyguards in tow. All eyes then turned to the remaining national leaders in front of them. The FBI man spoke next. "I'm Director Polanski of the FBI, for those of you who don't know who I am. I've tasked Assistant Deputy Director Ashley Bonhoff to be the FBI liaison officer for this task force. She's a career FBI agent with 15 years of experience working both in our counterintelligence and cybersecurity departments. Ashley brings a wealth of experience and is one of the key individuals who uncovered the postal worker scheme to rig the election. As an FBI agent, she will also provide your task force with the legal oversight and authority to operate within the U.S. This is critically important as we look to build a legal case against those who've orchestrated this grand scheme to take down our government. Ashley has the complete backing of the FBI and a direct line to me personally for any help or assistance your task force may need." Ashley stood and waved to identify herself to the group. Polanski continued. "During the operation in Kosovo, JSOC apprehended a Chinese national by the name of Wen Zhenyu. Many of you have no idea who he is, but thanks to some unique interrogation techniques, we learned that he was a deep cover agent for the Ministry of State Security. Since his initial interrogation in Kosovo, he's disclosed some new information that led us to discover that this entire UN-led peacekeeping mission, the rigging of our election, and the killing of our Supreme Court justices were all planned out many years ago." Several people in the room shared nervous glances. A few others gasped at the allegation, and a few more cursed quietly. Deputy Director Wilds from the NSA jumped in. "Once we knew when and where to look based on the intelligence Wen provided, we uncovered some information that painted a bigger picture for us on what's going on and who all is involved. If you'll remember back a few years ago, Google announced a major cyber breach. They learned that the account logins and passwords to every Gmail account had somehow been compromised. Once the FBI and FireEye got involved in the forensic analysis of what had happened, we eventually traced it back to ATP-10. It was initially believed the Kosovo Hacker Security Group, or KHS, was the group responsible. However, when we peeled away the onion, it became clear that they were just the patsy to the real culprits. ATP-10 is an elite Chinese cyber hacking unit. They go by the name Unit 61398, and they're essentially the Delta Force of cyber hackers. This group is probably responsible for the bulk of China's cyber espionage efforts globally. More importantly, Wen Zhenyu has admitted to not only being a member of this unit, but he was one of its senior commanders and deep undercover assets in Europe. He's the reason why the EU and nearby countries gave us so much grief while we were in Kosovo, and why parts of the Serbian government got involved in protecting the Islamic State in Serbia. They were being coerced by the Chinese government to impede our efforts in the region. They wanted to keep us from uncovering the true nature of the terrorist attacks happening in our country prior to the election, and put pressure on us to release Wen back to their custody. We obviously needed to hang on to Wen and continue to debrief him. However, we couldn't continue to hold him in Kosovo, and we couldn't move him out of the country, not with the Chinese using their economic and political power against Kosovo and the surrounding countries. So we reluctantly agreed to hand him over." Seth heard a few grumbles in the room. "General Lancaster here," Wilds said, pointing to the general from JSOC, "came up with a clever way for us to make the Chinese believe Wen had been killed so we wouldn't have to lose him as an intelligence source. Using something called deepfake technology, we developed a computer program that pieced together some very convincing CCTV footage of Wen that would pass a forensic analysis test. We made it appear like Wen had attacked and killed several of his guards, then acquired their weapons and broken himself out of Camp Bondsteel. We knew the Chinese were watching the base like a hawk with their satellites and probably human sources nearby, so we needed to make this look convincing from all vantage points. When Wen would have supposedly found his way out of the building, we used a body double and had him make his way over to a U.S. government-plated SUV, get in, and drive off the base. Through some further trickery, when the vehicle had driven about 3 miles away from Camp Bondsteel, we had it get blown up by an IED. The subsequent investigation into the blast, which we made sure was leaked, revealed that the IED had been placed by Luan Rexhepi's group, Islamic State in Kosovo. Supposedly, the ISK blew up the U.S. government vehicle in retaliation for the U.S.'s attack on their training camps and the capture of their leader. We weren't sure the PLA would buy it, but we made sure the CCTV video and report of what had happened was compromised and able to fall into their hands. Our hope was, once they pieced the information together, they'd believe Wen was killed and no longer a loose end or asset they had to recover. Thus far, that cover story is held up, and it appears they have written Wen Zhenyu off as a casualty of this new war. Director Ryerson from the CIA jumped into the conversation. Once Wen had been assured his government no longer believed he was alive, he told us what they were really after. While all of you know about the public Gmail attack, what you don't know is that was just the face of it. It was the PLA's cover for what they were really after, the White House secured email system. Now everyone leaned forward in their chairs, eager to know what all of this was about. Unit 61398 had been tasked with obtaining the secret communications between the President, the Secretary of Commerce, Treasury, and the President's key trade advisors, discussing a series of tough sanctions and trade regulations that were going to be aimed at reining in China. Armed with this information, the Chinese leaders had had an inside track on every move our government made economically. They also used that information to help foment a conspiracy between some other powerful individuals and groups to insert their Manchurian candidate into the 2020 race. What your task force is now being assigned to find out is who all is part of this conspiracy. Right now, the only person we know is involved for sure is Peng An. He's the CEO of the China Investment Corporation, which essentially runs China's sovereign wealth fund. He's also a close friend of President Chen. We need to find out who his co-conspirators are. Now that you guys know what's at stake and what your overall mission is, I'm going to hand you over to Major General Lancaster, who is going to be your task force commander. He has the full support of our agencies and the President. Ryerson signaled for the general to come forward. Then he and Wilds left the room. Their part in all of this was done. All eyes turned to the general from JSOC. It was suddenly apparent to Seth how he'd ended up in this room, since Lancaster was apparently in charge. Ryerson and Wiles are right, said Lancaster. We don't have a lot of time to uncover who all is involved in this conspiracy. The world is steadily uniting against us, and at some point, these powers are going to be more than even our great military can overcome. We have to defuse the situation, and we have to show the world that they've been deceived. That means we need to track down everyone involved in this. Right now, we have one name, Peng An. We need to figure out how we can capture him so we can debrief him on what he knows. That, or we need to find another link that can provide us with the other conspirators. Lancaster took a step back, softening his demeanor. Prior to digging into this, I'd like us to take a few minutes to go around the room. Briefly tell us who you are, what agency or group you work for, and what your area of expertise is. The next hour was spent getting to know everyone. The group quickly learned that the people in the room all brought a unique set of experiences and skills. a broad spectrum of expertise that would be needed to track a global adversary. They had a financial crimes expert from the IRS, a cyber hacker working for the NSA, and a plethora of military and counterintelligence operators. Once the introductions had been made, they were down to the business of trying to figure out how they were going to capture and question Peng An.
Thank you for watching our video. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss another video.
In the meantime, we have plenty of reading material to keep you busy. You can find it all on our website, frontlinepublishinginc.com.